Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Underneath. My name is Kale Zelden, and I'm here with an old friend and a pastor out in Sacramento named Paul Vanderclay. And Paul, it's great to see you. Of course, I've been on your show a couple of times, and I'm making you return the favor by having you on my show. What this show is really about, or what I'm trying to figure out what the show is really about, is this idea that going into the underneath is kind of a little bit of a play on words, but the idea that there's something subterranean conceptually that is sort of below everything, which kind of gives animation and form to all of that which we see around us, right? And so there's the old notion of in sort of explicitly theological and sacramental terms, we talk about an outward sign of an inner reality would be a kind of classic definition of a sacrament. And so I want to sort of take that idea as sort of a jumping off point to talk about story and this idea that stories, one of the things that I've heard you and other people in the corner talk about is stories are a kind of compression engine or compression machine. And I wanted to talk about it in that term, in that sense, but also story as a kind of social technology. Lastly, and then I'll kind of get you to jump in here on story, this idea that stories are compression engines, they're machines, but they're ultimately they're experience machines. And I think about this, of course, when I teach story. And I would imagine that you think about this quite a bit as you preach story, right? Because preaching and teaching, I mean, really, what's the difference in many real ways? And so I wonder how you conceive of that, both in your capacities as a pastor, but also in your work here in this liminal space, in this digital space, that the way that stories operate.
Well, you're right in that for pastors, we are always, in many ways, so one way to understand human beings after we get past the age of 3 or 4, where at some point even in our toddlerhood, we awaken, and we don't do it consciously. We don't sit there as toddlers and say, okay, I have different ways of processing this reality that I'm experiencing. Toddler can't conceptualize that. A toddler nearly universally, it seems, instinctively, it seems, begins to appropriate this technology of story as a way to organize and live this life that we do. I remember talking early on about story as sort of the operating system for human beings. And John Vervaeke sort of paused me and said, now you really should understand that we don't really start doing this until we're like 3 or 4. And a way to think about this is to think about the earliest memory you can sort of bring up. And of course, we also know now via cog-sci that there are, episodic memories, and there's sort of picture memories. I have a memory as I must have been a toddler, because I know the room in the house that I grew up with, just where that windowsill was, just kind of looking out. And there's a few other very fuzzy episodic memories that I have that are very early on. My father,
almost like moving images. These,
right.
Like when you do on the phone, you can sort of do a type of image. You press click, and it does a 2.5 second burst, right?
Yep.
And so I have a lot of those.
Yep.
So
it's kind of, at a certain point we start to organize our lives, our experiences, our relationships around these stories that we are implicitly forming. And so obviously story is a way to not only organize a lot of material, which is why I often call it a compression engine, but also a way to organize disparate types of experience and modes that we live in. Because when you think about what stories organize, stories both manage things out in the world and they manage processes and relationships.
Yeah, right. Because in that last part, they seem to really manage or mediate us,
Yes.
intersocially or something like that. That we that the harmony seems to be a story shared. Disharmony seems to be a story disagreed upon, or
Yes.
something at this kind of fundamental level, right?
And even when, so as a pastor, what you often do with a congregation, obviously in a Protestant church, we have these sermons from the Bible. Often pastors, even though so much of the biblical corpus is poetry, Protestants tend to focus on the narrative, because the great
What do you mean by
narratives,
that? What do you mean by that?
when in terms of, especially if Protestants are not sort of sticking to the lectionary,
Okay.
When you go through the Bible, even as someone say, they decide, wow, the Bible's an important book, I'm going to read it. They start reading it in Genesis, and Genesis is this narrative, which is like, wow, one of the greatest books, in the world, Genesis. And then they get into Exodus and it's continuing. Oh, wow, great sequel. And then of course they get past chapter 20 into chapter 21, and suddenly they're into law. And then they're into the alien technology of the tabernacle. And then suddenly
so that's interesting to me, right? So that you've got this narrative genesis, then you move into legal questions, which I think are like abstractions ultimately from that kind of the origin narrative, and then you have the building out of this space, right? So that is an interesting almost triptych. Maybe that's a sort of a picture of a development of humanness unto itself, right? So there's the sort of where are you coming from? What does it all mean? And then how do we worship? It's this sort of this cycle of progression there.
And as a preacher, so then you have almost the same thing in the New Testament, that you open the New Testament and you have Matthew and Mark and Luke, and it's like, I mean, of course, the synoptics are just story after story after story, all mixed together. And then, you get to John, and then some of these long discourses, and Acts again, more story. And then you get into these epistles. And suddenly people are like, I'm only reading one half of the conversation. And historically, we don't. And so then what I tend to often do when I'm trying to help people engage with the epistles would be, I try to form a narrative around it. And lately I've been doing that with Advent and some of the prophets on the way to, obviously, Christ's birth. So pastors,
and that's what I found so helpful. Just real quick, that's what I found so helpful with N.T. Wright's Paula biography, is it really does, it ultimately nests it in, as best as one can, and he's among the best, of course, nests it within this real epic story of how these things sort of unfold and come to be. It really, for me, as a kind of poetry first, philosophy second kind of mind, it was extremely helpful for me to sort of enter back into what Paul's laying out.
Right. And as a culture, I mean, we have, for all of the new age, I mean, remember Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and Sam Harris keeps wanting to sort of dismiss story. It's like, but as a culture, I mean, with streaming TV, we have just proliferated stories. I mean, you mean, we have so much story out there that you can sit down, and books and movies and TV shows, just narrative all over the place. And yet we're all talking about, like, we're also sort of in the midst of this story crisis. Yes.
Right. So there's a sort of almost an inverse proportion. Like, the more we just get plastered with, wall-to-wall story, you start to realize, wait, there's only a few really good stories, actually. So therefore, and that's kind of what I want. Like, so, I hear, you talk about story, and Jordan Peterson has been talking a lot about that's what ARC has been in theory about, right? A better story. Isn't that the sort of the subtag or subtitle of the whole conference? And yet, so, we talk about story as this sort of this phenomena that is, yet I don't know how much we kind of get into the nitty gritty of stories, themselves.
Well, and so on stage, as a pastor, as a performer, as a preacher, I deal a lot with story and storytelling, and every pastor will tell you, people forget your doctrinal points. They forget the structure of your argument. All of that stuff just it's the story they remember. It's Mabel, the story that I tell of a woman in a nursing home, and everybody remember. I used it with Peter Boghossian the other day. I mean, because it's just like bang, it grabs us. It pulls all this stuff together. And pastorally, when I started these Randos conversations on the channel, what essentially I did with people was within the conversation, what I help them do is I sort of help them begin to curate their story.
Right.
Because
and you always start there.
Yes.
You always start there.
Right. Because any pop psychologist will tell you, I mean, this is a powerful way for sort of human transformation. If you change your story about yourself, in a lot of ways, you have a pretty dramatic transformation. And what we often do with respect to difficulties in our lives, challenges in our lives, if we sort of reframe a story, then suddenly we have new power and new capacities. And we have this is what's behind Christian conversion, because Christian conversion is fundamentally entering into a different story. And so that is so powerful and so it's ubiquitous. I mean, we're not going to get away from it. We're not going to get around it, even though people right and left. I mean, for a while, John Vervaeke was sort of dismissing stories, and some of the new atheists were. It's sort of like dismissing air. I don't care how long you can hold your breath. You are going to breathe again. And that is the way we are with stories. So coming now, as you mentioned, to a story crisis is fascinating, because it's telling about the fact that there are complexities that stories mask. Right.
That's right. And I wonder, if there's a real moral component to storytelling, and I don't mean like telling a nice story or like a kind story. I don't mean it that way, but there's that stories have needs, that there seems to be an attempt. So a good storyteller seems to be able to submit themselves to some underlying reality, whatever you want to call that, right? But they submit themselves to it, and they are told it, right? And so you have the conceit of the muse, right? You have the conceit of whatever version of that muse is, as the story came to me in Hall, is the way that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight opens up. It's this almost like the excellence of the poet seems to be not in their ability to sort of flex and dominate, but rather to allow some other thing, spirit, we might say, to animate me, like I'm some kind of wind instrument, right? That it comes into me and through me and works through me. And so there's a weird humility that seems to be involved with a poet. And yet those of us, who are audience members, seem to worship the storyteller.
Yes.
I mean, who doesn't love the storyteller in the group?
Yes.
Every group of friends has a good storyteller, and they're the best. You love that guy.
Yes.
So like they're like equal parts. Well, interesting, and maybe Lewis gets into this a little bit in That Hideous Strength, when he's talking about the intricacies of masculinity, right? That masculinity involves both the ability to sort of like stand up and be strong, but also there's this receptivity to genuine masculinity. It's a very curious passage, and I know he gets a lot of heat from it from people who are kind of reading it through a sexual politics lens, but I think he's on to something about the creative process itself, that it requires both of these things.
Well, it gets into this. So I was, I'm working on Peterson's conversation with Chris Williamson, and Peterson has a nice section in that conversation where he's sort of talking about, instantiation versus something like Platonic forms.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating thing when it comes to a good storyteller. We sort of imagine maybe they wield this gift. But then when we watch them long enough, we begin to realize that something else seems to be wielding them.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. And that's the part that I think it merits a deeper, because there's a power in the ability to wield, but there's also like you think about, was it John Vervaeke at the conference in Chino who was talking about like the grip or something?
The optimal grip. He's
optimal grip. What was he talking about with that? If you could do it, because I think there's a connection to this wield thing.
Well, he talks about the fact that this is something that we work on constantly.
Yeah.
And, we do this even before. In our toddlerhood, we begin to wield stories to a degree. Our stories begin to wield us.
Right.
But even before that, we begin to try to get to this, gripping. And it does sort of well up from the body in that we scaffold up. I spent a lot of time with Rafe Kelly at the art conference, and he pays a lot of attention to embodiment. But it's, you think of someone like J.K. Rowling, who seemingly out of nowhere writes this huge thing, which, even I haven't myself read Harry Potter, but I know many people who have, and some people tell me
I've read it an embarrassing amount of time. So
some people. Let me ask you, what are your thoughts of the quality of the prose? Because I hear from many people that the story is great, but the books are a little clunky.
Well,
And now we're going to deal with dogma and orthodoxies, because if you say anything against those books,
I know. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I tried to read them first. I made a first attempt. Right. I picked it up because all the other people were like kind of squeeing about it. Like, oh, you got to read. It's so good. It's so good. Fine. So I picked it up and like, it's a children's book. I'm like, well, not interested.
Long children's books. I mean,
admittedly, this was just the first one, which is a reasonably slim volume. Right. And so a couple of years go by, and I think it's, I don't know, around the fifth time, and people are complaining because like the fifth book is like massive. It's like 900 pages. It's a big fat book. And I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting, because I had remembered trying to read the first one and being like, man, who could possibly like sit through 900 pages of that? Like it's a children's book. So anyway, I eventually go back and pick it up because I had heard from somebody who's like, well, okay, you should give them a shot. There's a design there. I'm like, okay. So anyway, so I pick them up and I read the first one, and like I liked it. It was fine. I got what she was doing. And then the second one is absolutely hilarious, right? Because it's Gilderoy Lockhart, and there's this puffing. He's just ridiculous. And I was like, oh, there's a level of satire here that it reminded me of the way that like a Bugs Bunny cartoon, is for the kids, but it's really, really for adults, right? That there's this level of appreciation, that I certainly would have liked it at 10 or 12 years old. But man, at 32 at the time, I was like, this is really quite something. So read through that. Third one was fine to me. I didn't particularly care for it so much the first time, but then by the time I got to the fourth one, and so the fourth one is interesting because, what I realized in retrospect is that she's kind of following almost the sort of the cognitive capacities of her main character. So when Harry Potter is a first form student, he's like, whatever, 12 years old, right? As he's 30, 40, when he comes to be like 14, 15, like the world expands. And of course, this is tracking exactly sort of with the way that you and I experience the world as kids, right? So that when the fourth one rolls around, it is when you get a sense that this is not just about this little house in this little, British suburb. It's not just about this interesting, cool castle called Hogwarts, but there's a whole world that opens up. And it happens, of course, brilliant, I think, is that the pretext of it is that they're going to the Quidditch World Cup. Right. And so it opens up the world and you realize, wait a second, there's all kinds of levels here. You're kind of whispering about it here or there, but it was still a really small world. And boom, this thing opens up. And I think the prose then kind of follows along with that trajectory. And this is, I don't think, the kind of thing that necessarily tracks with the movies. The movies are fine. I really like them. But what I really love about the books is that it kind of follows that. And so I would argue that there is intentionality and design in that prose style. So by the time you get into 4, 5, and 6, and 7, they're quite sophisticated. Again, as you and Harry's precocious sophistication, really builds out massively when the stakes. When it no longer becomes about winning a Quidditch game, it no longer becomes about, can I get a girlfriend? It all of a sudden becomes about this much, much bigger thing. That not only has he been involved in as a child, but also then he's like at the very, the crux, of the whole thing as he hunts for these Horcruxes, right? And so it becomes, I think, much more sophisticated as the series progresses. So I would disagree with that particular type of shade, against Rowling. I think that there's a design there. To me, her genius is design.
Interesting.
I do. And I think that a lot of people have this sort of romantic notion of, because this is going to somewhat contradict what I was going to say earlier, but let me see if I can square this circle. The people tend to have privilege engineering over poetry, right? That people like the idea of a plan and a plot and all these sorts of things, right? But then you have this other aspect of poetry, which is almost a sort of in the model of divination, right? Or invocation. Like I'm kind of a medium through which this thing channels and spits out and all that kind of stuff. And that has been the kind of the dominant image of the kind of the mad, crazed poet since the British Romantics. Right, this idea that you are invoking a spirit, right? They even explicitly sort of talk about this, but I think there's some sort of strange marriage. You talked about lately again. You've been talking about the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse, and I think that there's something going on there. And so a good poet might be a good plotter. A good poet might be a kind of like a wild channeling of the spirit, but a great poet is someone who can kind of create this spirit-filled tension, right? That animates beyond its borders or something like that.
Well, that's interesting because let's say a great basketball player.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
A great basketball player can generate his own shot. Yeah. A great basketball player can lead the entire team. A great basketball player does this consistently.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, somebody can get out on the court and, throw in one from half court and it's ever, but great person.
It's improvising, right? I mean, it's finding the sort of it's finding flow within structure,
Yes.
And it's the great myth of the jazz musician, right? Who kind of gets up there and just sort of like in this sort of wild craze, is like, and it's like, yeah, fine. But what you don't see has been the years and years and years of dedication to scales. I mean, is there anything less sexy than a scale, right? But the jazz musician has put himself in this position of mastery so that he can kind of channel the spirit,
Yes.
So I think that a good storyteller. So I wanted to ask you this question as a preacher, because I have questions in regard to my teaching, right? I would never show up to a class without a plan. Right? And sometimes, like, boy, I need that plan because it's like dying up here, But it's like, anybody out there? Anybody? And then there are some days in which I've got and then you execute it reasonably well, and you're being a professional. Sometimes I feel like the real days in which I'm a professional teacher when I'm just sort of keeping it together, right? Yeah. That day. But man, there are some days you walk in there and I read a passage out loud, and all of a sudden this entire script just is like, well, that's wrong, because my mind is just, I am catching a wave. Like, I am on this thing, and the only reason I ever stop is because the bell goes off.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not just me blabbing, it's me interacting and talking, and analogies are firing, and I've hit, and I would imagine preaching has that quality to it.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. All the time.
Yeah.
And like you say, I go every Sunday. I have a rough draft for Sunday. I have a plan. I have a plan for Sunday. Now, anybody who actually looks at the rough draft and looks what happens on Sunday will notice the difference, also because there's a difference in audience.
Sure. This
and
versus,
then there are times, like, for example, in the UK, I last year, not this last trip, but the trip before, I had this event with Tom Holland, and Glenn didn't tell me anything of the plan beforehand. And so first I discovered, now first I'm going to have a conversation with this other woman. I know nothing about her. I know nothing about what's on top. She stands up and then, she stands up and she reads a paper about something that I don't know a lot about. And I'm just like, how's this going to go? Yeah. And then we have this little break in between. And then Glenn basically comes to me and says, now for the Holland thing, you're going to talk, and then we're going to talk to Tom. And it's like, I have zero plan. Yeah. I've got to pull this thing out and have it go. And however well it went, anybody can find the video and you can tell me what you think of it. Yeah. So one of the things that you learn is that over time, when you get a lot of experience, you have a lot of things that you can generate your own shot much more easily, because you've been on the court a long time. And so there's stuff that you have in little turns and phrases. And so boom, 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 boom. But it's always also the case that I think about someone like C.S. Lewis, who, has a sort of explodes onto the English scene during the war with these radio addresses. And then those kind of become a book. And then after a period, after that and after the war, there was a sense in which for a lot of people, Lewis was a has-been. He had written Screw Tape Letters, he had done the radio addresses, and, he had done, some of his formal apologetics like Miracles. And then, nobody's thinking about C.S. Lewis anymore. And then he just starts popping out children's books, and people are like, what's with this? And so even people that centuries later we consider the greats, had moments at periods in their life where everything just seems to they can just sort of spin gold out of straw, and other periods in their life that they can't do a darn thing worth anything.
It's an interesting analog to this is, I was tweeting about this the other day, but I grew up, I was in high school in a sort of interesting period of time musically. I loved music as a high school kid. And really the kind of only thing that was available was sort of this sort of interesting moment in kind of Britpop, or it was hair metal bands. And I wasn't particularly interested in either of those things, really. And so what it compelled me to do, and part of this was helped by an older brother, is that I did this sort of massive deep dive into classic rock. And so, which in retrospect turns out to really have been my first real research project. And I really threw myself deeply into this, and, sleuthing at record stores and going through stacks and stacks and trying to find this, that, and the other. And at any rate, one of the things that I would do is I would find old copies of like Rolling Stone magazine. And, I would read them, and, you would read things and, it's like, I don't know, it's like 1974, and people are asking the question, like, are the Stones done? And so anyway, my point is that, like when you're in the middle of the thing, it's not written, and yet in retrospect, like, you're a total fool to say that, like, Dylan was done in 1968. Like, that's absurd, right? Or that, they had a good first two albums, but they'll probably never do something in. And then there's this sort of 5-year period of nothing, and then it just generates you find the genius again. And it's better than the earlier stuff because it's more mature and you've grown and all those kinds of things. And so, I feel that way as an older teacher. I was a baby teacher once. You were a baby preacher once, and you could have, you've got your, I would say, I think of the Crayola boxes. You've got the 8 crayons, and then you've got the 24 and the 48, right? And I was playing with 24 for a while, and all of a sudden you realize you've leveled up to the 84, right? And you've got like this brick of color that you can now wield. And even now, as I move past 50, I feel like I've got more going on in my head right now than ever. And part of that is maturity and age, right? Of course, but part of it's reps. But part of it is, I teach the same thing. You do too. You teach the Bible. And I teach the same basic things each year, right? And so every year during Advent, I teach Macbeth for independent from Advent reasons, right? So every, September, I teach Dante. Every beginning of October, I teach Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Every November, I'm teaching the Canterbury Tales, right? And so there has come this sort of liturgical quality to my teaching, and there's something that kind of comes out of those repetitions. It's not every day, but it's every year. But also, but my metaphors have grown substantially, in this process.
Yeah.
And so I get a lot of questions, all right, Kale, you talk about old books all the time. You talk about wisdom, and wisdom's not optional, and all this sort of stuff. It's like, I'm 50 and I didn't get any of that stuff. Like, I got nothing. I went to school for, business, and I got really good at business, and I did the business thing. And now I'm 50 whatever years old. And like, I don't have any of that stuff that you're talking about, Kale. And, and there's almost this sense like, yeah, like I tried to, Kale, you talk about the Odyssey or something, and I picked it up and I didn't know what to do with it. And I know, what do you make of that? Is that something you sense when you talk to people?
Well, so I did this video on this other video on the death of cinema.
Yeah, that was a great one. Yeah, I saw it.
And, he made the point that audiences need formation as well.
Love that. Oh my gosh. Yes.
And he made the point that because of sort of how things rolled out in the early aughts, America suddenly, in terms of the story world, got a steady diet of Marvel. And then you, of course, had Batman and Superman trying to keep up and catch up. And of course, before that, we had Harry Potter, and American
Lord of the Rings, and
right.
Yeah.
American audiences were formed into a certain way. And part of what, we are doing in church and in school, which church, not so much, but still school, you sort of have a captive audience. These kids are, these kids got to go to school. And
they have to do my reading, right? They have to.
That's right. Church, less and less so, but to a degree, there is sort of a stable audience. People are going to show up and they're going to listen, and some of that is going to happen. And so you also have sort of the formational lectionary that, and you very much have this.
Because, as a Catholic, right.
Well, but also that, that you are specifically in the business of forming these young minds to, at some point in their life, be able to open up Shakespeare and be able to appreciate it. Whereas many in the population, they simply can't, because they have not been formed. Their sensibilities have not been cultivated and led to the point where, and Lewis talks about this a lot, obviously, where, you want to learn Greek to the point where you can sort of effortlessly enjoy Greeks,
Mm-hmm.
Greek classics in
Mm-hmm.
their original language.
Mm-hmm.
And, whereas sort of that Erasmian educational model has receded,
Yeah.
we still want to do that even with English, so that people can have an appreciation, because it is not it is not innate within us. But yet part of
Yeah.
it,
Right. Yeah. Right.
but yet there is also the quality where, I mean, in some ways, some might argue that what part of the genius, and I really loved how you just sort of laid out Harry Potter, that was really helpful for me, is that she had been doing that formation all through that series of books. So that once they sort of get a sense of, oh, Harry Potter, now maybe they can read Tolkien with a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Um,
right. That's right.
and then from
Well,
on and on.
yeah. So you just said something that's interesting. The story of Harry Potter is, in one sense, the story of, the whole story is contained in the line in the first book when Hagrid, the big super sort of half giant creature from Hogwarts, comes to fetch Harry, right? And his line to him is like, "You're a wizard, Harry." You Right, and all of a sudden, he goes from this sort of basically abused stepchild who lives under the stairs. He's like somebody, right? And so, like, you talk about a kind of epistemological flip or an existential flip. It's like all of a sudden, that which was a total enigma, in other words, life was terrible, and all of a sudden, all of these little things here and there, they click into place, like, oh, that's what that is. And then it's super interesting. So he goes on his first shopping spree with Hagrid, and he finds out, not only are you not poor, you have your own money, Harry, right? And they go and they figure that part out, and then he goes and gets all the stuff. And but as soon as he walks into this sort of this alternate world, right, this covered world, it becomes unlocked to him. Everybody knows who he is. That there's this story, and they're like, oh, it's that. Oh, there's the kid. And all this sort of. And so this experience of his is when Hagrid says, you think that the end of the story is, oh, Harry, you're a wizard, but it's the beginning of the story. It then begins. Well, what does that mean? For him. And I think what strikes me about the moment in the story, you've talked about these kinds of things before, Paul, right? That there's a moment in the man, right? But the moment in that story is that these sort of questions of identity, that she very much leveraged, were perfect for the moment, right? That it absolutely, caught fire, lightning struck, right, as the little zigzag on his forehead would suggest, that there was something, people clearly needed to hear some version of, you're a wizard, whatever that means, right? I mean, but there's something there, like there's gold to be mined in that particular that particular moment.
And you have that with Christian conversion.
Yes, right. I was just
because suddenly someone realizes. I mean, and again, it's like you are a child of the King. You are not simply the you are not an ape.
Yeah.
You are you are majestic. You hold dominion over this world. And so
well, this is exactly what you're getting at with the story. This dismissal of the materialist dismissal of story. And you were talking about that earlier. About Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, right? And what I found continually interesting about there's a sort of particular sort of scientific story that is sort of has been ascendant for a long time, which is in essence a kind of strange story to tell, because it tells human beings that they're nothing more than apes, which of course was precisely the anxiety of the biblically minded people, at the end, in the 19th century. But you have sold that story very successfully. I mean, very, very successfully. And even the evolutionary psychologists, they've really sold that really well. And yet, there seems to have been a cost to that narrative, so that as soon as somebody like Jordan Peterson says, well, maybe not, it's like it's another man in a moment type situation, or a story in a moment that catches fire. And I, Paul, I know you've been doing this sort of riffing on Peterson for a long time, and I would agree with that. I think he's sort of in another moment right now.
Yep.
I think you're savvy to that. You're sensing the pattern, an ascendancy pattern there. But what he told is essentially that, no, it actually means something. This Genesis thing, it actually means something. And the reason, and now we have the confirmation that it means something, because as soon as he started talking about Genesis, everybody lining up to talk about the book of Genesis and crowded packed theaters, like totally ridiculous. Then it's a diagnosis of an under or unacknowledged problem. And, the sort of the existential problem that if all this stuff is true, if materialism is true, then what's the bloody point?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a bad story.
Yeah.
Right. It's a bad story. It's compelling for a while, and it accelerates you. You can kind of feel superior to other people because you can sort of pretend like you're kind of almost like a new priesthood of people who you get it, and some people don't get it. But then you find out at the end, that really what you're going to spend your time doing is like hawking a meditation app.
Well, it's kind of, sometimes I listen to some of these new atheists or old new atheists.
Old new atheists.
They're kind of like the kids I remember at high school that figured out, gosh, we can cut classes.
That's right.
And so they spent their time at the gas station next to the school smoking cigarettes. It's like, yeah, was that an upgrade? Now you this is what your new freedom bought you. All right. Yeah. And
so again, like, it's bad story.
Yeah, it's bad story.
It's bad story.
You're really cool. You've learned to smoke now at the age of 15, and you're cutting
right.
classes and you're spending time. Maybe someday you'll work at that gas station.
Yeah, right.
How about that?
Right.
No.
I like that.
Is that as high as you can go? Maybe.
Yeah. But you get it. Again, that's a story of bad sacrifice.
Yes.
To riff on Peterson stuff. It's a story of cheap sacrifice, as opposed to sort of the more heroic call that Peterson seems to be calling people perpetually to. Like, you need to be more than this. Like, you are not, you're saying you are. So and
then, well, just to finish up with Rowling's.
It's
interesting because then we get to, the witch trial of J.K. Rowling's. Megan Phelps Roper does this podcast, and it's interesting where Rowling's, Harry Potter was, the story and the moment, and so many people found their identity through this. And then a question is going to be 200 years from now, now we're getting back into Greeks and Achilles, and, will I be remembered? Is the choice that Achilles gets to make in terms of his destiny. 200 years from now, will anybody know Harry Potter? And because it's interesting, because you don't have to go back too far. I was listening to The Rest Is History. They were talking about some really popular books in the 19th century that all the young British, elites were. I mean, that was their Harry Potter story. And now it gets mentioned in a historical podcast, and everybody's like, only the real English history nerds will say, oh yeah, those were very popular books back then. And now they're sort of so. And that's the realization that we live in a world where there are spirits, and it's so funny because the new atheists sort of, loved telling the story of how small we are.
Yeah.
But you very much get the sense that the whole reason for their worldview is, in fact, to sort of make sure that we are the only ape left on top. When in fact, once you begin to realize that, no, we are in the midst of spiritual, personal forces that are far beyond us, that can ruin our lives very quickly, going beyond just sort of the medium people that can cancel you. Well, this is a story we dare not tell, because suddenly then we feel exposed. And if we are exposed, where can we go for solace and comfort? And then the new atheists kind of want to say, oh, you should You should just embrace your smallness. Oh, okay. Really? Are you sure that this story of no agents, no personal agency above we human beings
Mm-hmm.
isn't itself a function of your own fears?
Yeah.
Because when you look at the bigger stories and you realize, for as massive and as wealthy and as powerful J.K. Rowling's became,
Mm-hmm.
how quickly did a whole group of people, were they ready to burn her books?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I don't know why this popped in my head, but I'm going to hazard it. Maybe you can make sense out of it. But remember listening to an old Paul Kingsnorth podcast. I believe it was on maybe Rebel Wisdom and one of those older ones. So it's a couple of years ago now. And he was talking about his unexpected, turn to Christianity. And he said he tried to be a Wiccan for a period of time. And he ultimately found it unsatisfying, and he sort of kind of jumps out of his story, and he says, if you're going to like convert to something, look for old people, like look for people like who are old and wise in the tradition. And of course, the irony of with Wiccan is that it alleges sort of to be the sort of like the more ancient one, but it's not. It's completely fabricated. It's completely modern. And
it's as fictitious as Harry Potter.
That's
right.
It
really is.
That's right. It's just kind of with a better LARP, or a little bit more authentic LARP. And but the reason why I'm bringing this up is like if we think of the roots of stories, right? And this is sort of getting us back to the underneath, right? Those stories that are most ultimately resonant and ultimately meaningful and ultimately enduring seem to tap into some deeper well that is much longer on the time horizon than whatever's hot right now.
Right.
So and you can see this with music, and you can see this with Netflix, right? I mean, how much is just pumping out show after show after show after show, and you might watch it, be like, oh, it's kind of interesting, cool, and then it just kind of goes away. And there are only really a few of them that really seem to rise to that level where they kind of stick with you. And my contention is that those that stick with you, right, number one, they work, right? So if we think of going back to this idea of stories as a kind of technology, stories as a kind of compression engine, stories as an experience machine, like they really work and they seem to satisfy, all the kind of the layers and the levels up and down your sort of personal hierarchy or something like that. And so much of it seems to just be sort of like time holding, background noise, music, as opposed to something that is substantial and real, right? And so we kind of keep going back to this question of, the real. And so you've been talking about this idea of, the really real and the real, and going back and forth with this. And when you have an experience of the really real, this is something that you were quoting Vervaeke, I think, just the other day. He says, you have a sense of ultimacy, like you want to kind of keep going back to that thing. But I think stories work that way too.
Yep, they do. And it's not just stories, but why on earth do we still know who Plato is, and why are his ideas still out there? One of the things that I saw through Jordan was sort of seeing this Darwinian aspect to it's sort of a Darwinian test for knowledge of the Lindy effect, as Taleb calls it, where if it's something, we can still say the name Dante and Chaucer, and there are classics because for some reason they have endured, and even in the midst of all of this schlock that Netflix is just pouring out into it.
Yeah.
And then someone said, well, why was Harry Potter so great? Well, she had a sense, she picked up the patterns of the greats and was able to, and even looking at, I was reading this book on the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis, and And it's like, oh, the Great Divorce. Of course that was Dante. Why didn't I see that was Dante?
Right.
I mean, it's just so obvious.
Right. And when you start sharpening your metaphors, so to speak, or building out those metaphors, or, going into deeper and deeper fractal levels of resolution, you start to see that, it's actually not even Dante that you're sensing. Right. And that there's this, and I never know if it's an underneath or an above. Anyway,
that's right.
I know. Yeah, it goes both ways. But that iconic image of Dante alone, lost in a dark wood, that is as primeval, or paradigmatic, or it's pure, right? Because without even ever having been lost in the woods and alone, like, exactly kind of what that is, and you also don't know how you got here, and you also don't know how to get out, right? And then that is an archetype that seems to exist in some kind of spiritual plane, that materialists simply cannot account for.
Yeah.
And I think that's my frustration with the story. And so so they'll even look at something like a Dante or like a C.S. Lewis, and they will merely see structure.
Yeah.
And and they seem to be unwilling to think of, and this is why I want to go back to an experience machine, right? So because it kind of takes in both the sort of the flesh and the mechanics of things. Of course, you can have flesh mechanics too, but that there seems this. If a machine is a kind of physical system, applying forces, controlling movements in order to bring about some kind of an action, right? Then, so we can think about that mechanically, either through with like wood and steel and all these things, or with bone and flesh and muscle and all this sort of. Yet there seems to be this other engine that is happening at the same time that is moving spirit.
Yeah.
And I don't really quite know how to talk about that, other than to just start saying exactly kind of what we're saying now.
I think that's part of what our moment is, that we've been bathing in this flat land for so long that we have these intuitions of the other dimension, and we see, what other language. Look at we very quickly look at the language that we use. Well, that was a concept. It was a moment. It was a fad. It was a fashion. All of those words are too weak to talk about the forces that we see moving this world. And the agency, I mean, we see. Now, someone might say, oh, we're just projecting agency into it. I don't find that convincing. I don't find that convincing. And part of the problem is that, okay, let's say I'm wrong. So what? That's part of the problem of nihilism, is that once it gets that barren, then you sort of have, I mean, the video that I'd like to do today is I never get to do all the videos I want to, but the atheists have a duty crisis. And Lewis pointed this out.
Okay. What do you mean by that? This is interesting to me. A duty crisis?
A duty crisis. Well, I watched Alex O'Connor, all these apes doth protest too much with respect to Ayan Hirsi Ali. They all consider themselves apes, and they're all complaining. And it's like, do apes complain?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
What does it matter to an ape?
It doesn't matter to an ape, but they're all complaining about her. And part of the issue, and actually Sarah Hyder pointed this out in that trigonometry video, that
excellent.
That there's a thing called duty. And Lewis points this out with the atheists of his time,
Mm-hmm.
that he says all of these people are just randomness and chaos and nihilism until humanity must be preserved.
Yeah.
Israelis or Gazans must be rescued.
That's right.
And Lewis is like, why?
Yeah.
You don't, you cut that out when you cut out the story. There's no, fat Thor might as well stay drinking beer and eating nachos.
Right. Playing video games. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we have basically seen the product of the story of nihilism playing out in people's lives. And
what is that line? Remember that Irish woman you had interviewed or you were listening to, like, lonely lives, people alone in their bedrooms?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. It's a great line. I just every now and again it pops into my head, but it's like that's what we have wrought.
That's right.
Right. That's what we have wielded. We've created that world.
Stories have power. Stories move us. Stories are spiritual in that sense, in that they, again, I always point to, well, what is spirit? Well, just use Jesus' definition from John 3. Spirit is the thing that moves the trees. When you look out the window and you see the trees moving, you might think, oh, do those trees have muscles and brains? And no, they don't have any of that. The spirit is moving the trees. Spirit and wind are the same thing. And the stories that have been told, the nihilistic stories, have given us fat Thor. That's what they've given us.
Yeah, right. Good. Yes, that's right.
And that has multiplied in the culture. And now everybody wakes up and they're like, fat Thor, this isn't good. Well, how do you know this isn't good? Isn't that the tell us of your story? Or you don't have tell us either.
Right. So, right. Well, because fat Thor is a lie. Like, we just know this, right? It's like offensive to the spirit. It's so mean. It's so mean in stingy. To do that to your audience, right? And so it's mean to do that to Thor, right? I mean, like, that's and I would say it's not just me; it's a lie, right? And I worry that the crisis of story that we do seem to be living through is the inability to call a lie, or the unwillingness to call a lie in story, right? And so I look at somebody like what's the guy's name who was writing Game of Thrones? George Martin, and I can't help but wonder if part of the reason why he can't finish the story is that he doesn't know how to tell the story without lying, or the lie is preventing him from finishing the story. Yeah. Right. It's like there's this strange wish to deny satisfaction. And it's like, man, that's some really messed up stuff. It kind of makes me sad. Yeah. It's like not being able to end the Iliad. It's like not being able to end Macbeth. Like, tell the truth, because the story demands it. And if you don't have the guts to do it, talk about men without chests. It's just, you don't want to. I don't know. I believe. Or maybe I believe that we are living in the story that we collectively are telling ourselves. Yes. And, looking at the numbers, as someone who works in the trenches and schools and whatnot, I know your wife's a teacher too, like, looking at the kind of the progress report right now, Paul, it's not looking very good.
Schools are in crisis.
Yeah.
They really are.
Yeah. And what I find interesting, now I'm fortunate, I live and work at a great place, and we're doing pretty well.
Your school still has your classes,
right? Well, right, and my kids are showing up, yes. right, and so, but nobody's talking about that. It is not, some astronomical, some like half of the teachers want to quit, and I don't quite. And I wonder what will come of this, because I don't see the necessary moral courage and strength necessary to change the story.
Yeah.
right? I mean, if we keep kind of going back, like, we have decided to tell a certain story to ourselves and to our kids through our schools, let's say. You could say the same thing about churches, and we can get into that too. It's the same thing, right? So we're telling this story, and we seem really wedded to the narrative, and yet we seem to we pretend that we like evidence-based X and evidence-based Y. Well, what about evidence-based results, of our school system? What about the evidence-based results of our church system? And what about the evidence-based results of our military system? Our university system? Like, again, don't want to be, Debbie Downer here, but it seems to me that the story is sick, and sick stories make sick people. And so then I quip, I text you from time to time and say, yeah, well, that's because we need poetry. And I guess what I mean by that is, you said something interesting the other day, poetry is consummation. And you kind of coyly reminded your audience, well, the consummation, the act of consummating a marriage is when the man and the woman come together and form, the union, the solidify, bring about a spiritual reality, right? It's a physical manifestation of a physical reality. And
that act is, as the Catholics continue to remind us, that act is intended to produce new life.
That's right. I mean, literally, right? I mean, that's
physically.
Will you allow me to say literally in this capacity, right?
No, you should say physically, because it's a physical.
That's right.
It's a physical act, and it's a physical being that the physical act is designed to bring into this world.
And Paul, did you ever in your wildest dreams growing up think that we would ever get to the moment where people would stop having sex?
No.
Right?
No.
I mean, that's wild. That is absolutely bonkers wild.
Yeah, I mean,
this is where we are.
Yeah, because you look at it. People love to compare us to apes, and human beings are, we're strange apes in that we, sexually speaking, we're very strange apes. And we, part of the reason we're such a successful species is that human beings really like to have sex.
That's right.
And we've gotten to the point where, fat Thor can't get it up.
Yeah, right. No, but I think that, I think that's a tell. I think that's a real tell
for an episode.
Yeah. Fat Thor can't get it up. Right here, ladies and gentlemen, here at the Underneath, featuring Pastor Paul Vanderklay, and but so then the question then is, okay, that's a story. Fat Thor can't get it up. That's a story, and it appears to be the correct one right now. So what is that telling us? Maybe Fat Thor not being able to get it up is an indication that a story is working.
Yep.
Right. You can be as gods. You can be as gods. That's a story. Right.
And that story has repeated again and again and again through history. And then we can get into the decadence now.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
That Douthat has put on that societies rise and fall, and they're not just the big rise and fall. There's lots of little rises and fall. I mean, that continues to happen.
Sure. Well, I remember as a kid in high school, I took an Old Testament class, right, and it was pretty bad actually. It was very modernist, and it was all of that sort of stuff. But I remember at a certain point, Israel goes up and Israel goes down, and Israel goes up and Israel goes down, right? And I remember at one point being like, "Could you guys just like get it together here? Like, duh, it's so obvious." I know, obviously, things are more complicated than that, but that was, the pattern, cried out, to you in that moment. And so, is there a way to arrest decadence? Maybe, is there a way? Jordan's trying to sell a new story. Yet I don't know, man.
Well, and I think going back to the spiritual new life, the story of Jesus' birth. We're coming into that season.
That's right.
Comes at a point when, we're in Advent now.
Yeah.
And there's waiting for, this is this is one of the, Glenn Scrivener made this critique of Jordan's work, and I think it's a very fair critique. Although there are moments when Jordan gets beyond it, I think. But there are, and it's all up to us. And on some hand, there's a lot that's up to us. It's up to us to do things. There's absolutely no question about that. But it's when God moves. It's when God sends a savior, and God, and there's always, even Elijah after Carmel, this great moment of victory over the prophets of Baal. It's at that moment that he despairs.
Right.
And God says, hey, I've got 7,000 people who haven't bent the knee to Baal. And Paul in 2 Corinthians, speaks of his despair. And God says, I have many people in this city. And in some ways, we don't have. I also enjoyed in the Williamson-Peterson video where Peterson was talking about there's dopamine, there's sort of
dopaminergic,
which is the meaningful grasp, but then there's consummatory as well. And both of those realities are there. And if it weren't for the decadence and the decline and the fact that the orgs seem to be, the org seemed to be wiping the dwarves out, that this silly little group of dwarves is going to do the unthinkable of traveling to the Misty Mountain and taking out Smog. So we're not going to enjoy the adventure without the decline. And so every moment of impending doom is a opportunity for God to do a new thing amongst us and for us to participate in this grand story. Now, I actually think a lot about the fact that how is it actually going to go in the age to come? Because it can't just be consummation all the time. What will God have for us in the age to come? And I think about that and I ponder about it, but I don't fret about it because, of course, what do I know?
Right.
God, who can write a story like the one that we're enjoying in the Christian world now, will certainly give us something that will be even more satisfying than the story that we are participating in at the moment.
Yeah, eye has not seen, ear has not heard. Right. I mean, this is the vision of that surpasseth understanding. I mean, that's the goodies, right? But that's complex, right? That's a complex, ambiguous feeling thing, and I wonder. Maybe this is my last question to you, because I know you've got shows to record and I've got homeworks to grade. But there seems to be a suppressed appetite for complexity. Now, I know you talk a lot about it because John talks a lot about combinatorial explosiveness and all that sort of stuff. And so I'm very sympathetic to people looking for ways to simplify, but I wonder if that move to simplify isn't sort of short-circuiting the better story. I see this in church circles quite a bit. There's the retreat to legalism. There's a retreat to formalism. There's a retreat to clear lines. And these kinds of things. And I can't help but feel like, even though me, I'm pretty serious about those things. I can't help but think that that's a misplaced. That's not a desire for good. It's sort of a fear move as opposed to a courage move.
Yeah. And there's an aspect of idolatrous instrumentality in it as well. If we can reduce the complexity of this moment into a binary choice, then you get all sorts of cheats in that. There's self-righteousness, there's self-sufficiency, there's all sorts of idolatrous moves in there. Yet at the same time, there, choose ye this day who you will serve, and so you can't completely eliminate it, but you have to at the same time keep an eye on it and realize there are binary choices, but the binary and the analog live in the same world, and they never get rid of each other.
That's interesting. That's
And
interesting.
and so that's out there.
Hmm.
And yeah, well, there was another thought I had, which has escaped me too.
Have you if you think of it, let me know. But I just the last little thing here, maybe. Have you been doing any kind of thinking about the role that the digital plays in our crisis of story?
Digital meaning?
Yeah, like that's why that's good. Yeah. Well, I guess I first mean it actually, like digital technology versus, analog technology, something like that. But that as we move further and further into the black mirror, we are flattening even our story. I think of the way that a digital signal is captured versus the way that an analog signal is captured. And, the digital is just chopped up bits of zeros and ones, and the analog is just sort of like a piece of tape on a dusty table. It just picks up everything,
Yeah. Yeah. The texture, I remember having a conversation with not Kale, with Byrne about texture.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think about the proliferation of stories, and how on one hand, or how what that might finally mean is, I remember what I was thinking about. I was thinking about like stories of old. You were talking about, and I think this like stories of old, a video that I did a little bit comparing that with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
I should rewatch his video on there, basically talking about the decay of story, and where he noted that there were certain elements in stories that were working, like a lightsaber sort of held the Star Wars story together, and the ring sort of holds Tolkien together.
Right.
And there are, again, it's an interesting, we are monofocal creatures. We can't, so because we're monofocal, binaries are always emerge, because we can manage binaries. Yes, no, back, forth. When you get to threes, we get a little overloaded. We get a little flooded. So I think,
which is again, I think that's kind of the Christian genius, right? Is that the threes keep us in a kind of generative tension, whereas binaries force A B A B A B. And the mystery of the three.
After three, it sort of collapses back into a binary, the one and the many.
Right.
So
that's
three
right.
is the place that holds the tension.
Yeah.
And so I think as we continue to create for ourselves new problems, this has been the amazing thing about history, is that new problems, we create problems for ourselves, and stories get resolved. Not always happily, almost always with tremendous loss. We live in the age of decay. None of us get out of this life alive. That's the way it goes. But there is an optimism that I have, that, my conversation with Peter Boghossian. How can you be so optimistic? I'm a Christian. Look at our story. Look at how it ends. It ends in consummation, and then people want then to debate about all of the little particulars, but I can say, I don't know those particulars, but I know the judge of heaven and earth, and I trust him. And so that's where my optimism comes.
Right, because the I think part of the Christian optimism is an unwillingness to pretend that there are solutions in time, right? And so that the we know that it's always trade-offs, and that people who don't believe in don't have a metaphysics or a beyond, let's say, um, you know, simply can't abide the fact that things can't get fixed right here now. And I think that's exhausting. Like metaphysically exhausting. But it still leaves you with the nihilism problem, which is like, in the end, why does it even matter?
Right.
So, all right. Well, look, Paul, I have to be honest with you. I'm not really sure how to land a plane, because I don't want to land the plane. I want to keep talking.
Now we will keep talking. We will
Yeah.
have more conversations, Kale.
Oh, indeed. I want to thank you, for coming on here and pushing me a little bit more on this notion of story. It's a funny thing because I spend my career teaching story, and it's just so funny. Like I can feel like such a master of the craft of teaching story, and yet you poke me once, you say, well, what's a story? And you're like, hey, I don't really know, but yeah, I do know, right? And so I appreciate you helping me to find a better way to articulate it, and I do think that this question of story is not going to go away. And hopefully we will, learn maybe to submit a little bit more to, the demands of true story. So, all right. Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Kale.
All right. Take care, brother.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right.